All right, hello and welcome to week 5. And the reading assignment for this week is 3 chapters. So that means 3 choices for each of the essays. Um, and also notice that we're skipping chapter 12, so feel free to read that chapter. It's about the Second Great Awakening and religion in America. It's a really important topic. Just couldn't bring myself to give you guys 4 chapters this week. So you only have the 3 chapters, and don't accidentally pick one of the chapter 12 historian toolbox and dueling document features for your essays. Anyway, chapter 10, where country looks generally like this as we enter the 1820s, and Chapter 10 really covers changes that occur as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which adds factories, transportation revolution, communications revolution. A lot of it is connected to this. This is the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney, 1790s. Transforms the economy. This invention comes just at a time when cotton is becoming greater and greater demand as textile mills are opening up first in England, and now there's textile mills opening up in New England and the rest of the Northeast. So the demand for cotton is huge, and this machine makes it like 50 times more efficient to process cotton. It works simply by separating the little sticky seeds from the cotton ball. So this invention directly leads to this. There's a direct correlation between production of cotton and growth in slavery. If you notice the number of slaves, cotton production, there's virtually no cotton production before the 1820s. By the outbreak of the Civil War, cotton production is large, and there's 4 million enslaved human beings in the United States. Here's a map showing the same sort of thing. Here's cotton production represented by the red here. I mean, it's very limited in 1820. By 1860, it spread across the South. I notice this is known as the Black Belt. The soil's so fertile, it's called the Black Belt. And then along the Mississippi River. So cotton, by the eve of the Civil War, has become the cash crop. The saying goes, King Cotton. As this is happening, other developments include the opening of the Erie Canal. This opens up the U.S. frontier because now farmers can ship their grain, typically grain, but other stuff like pork bellies and cattle and all sorts of agricultural crops, but primarily corn and wheat, can now get shipped along the Erie Canal, down the Hudson River to New York City, out to foreign ports, out to domestic ports. It just makes it much more profitable to move west and become farmers, and that's what people start to do. They start flooding the frontier and homesteading farms. The steam engine also allows for quicker travel along not just the Erie Canal, but the Mississippi River is going to become a highway of transport because the steam ship allows ships to go upriver fairly quickly, whereas before it was almost impossible to go upriver, more than a few miles an hour. Steam also leads to the expansion of the rails. This is obviously a real early example of a steam locomotive. But as you probably know, the locomotive is going to transform America. It's going once the transcontinental rail line opens in 1869, you have a direct connection between the East Coast and the West Coast over rails, shortening travel times, of course. Telegraph is also part of this market revolution and industrial revolution. Now you can send messages to someone thousands of miles away virtually instantaneously. If you don't know, this is known as Morse code. One of the inventors of the telegraph, a guy named Samuel Morse, also came up with a code by which you represent letters with a series of dots and or dashes. And if you break the code and spell this out, it says, "What hath God wrought?" That was the first message Samuel Morse sent across the telegraph. And all the Industrial Revolution owes itself to Watt's steam engine, which was invented in England by James Watt in the mid 18th century. It was developed, out of an early mining pump, but it becomes fairly advanced, and you can see the steam engine now can turn a wheel, which can turn machines in every room of this building, and that's what we call a factory. So thanks to Watt's steam engine, we get factories that eventually, by the mid 19th century, they're looking like this. And the skies above London and Birmingham and Manchester, not to mention New York City and Pittsburgh and other American cities, start to look like this. And another key development during this period is people are moving away from farms and into the cities. And that's what's represented by here. In the Revolutionary period, about 5% of all the people in the United States lived in cities. That grows here. This is all because people are moving from the farms, they're taking factory jobs. And by, our modern day, more than 80% of us live in cities. Okay, and then moving on to chapter 11, this chapter is all about the rise of democracy. It's all about the expansion of suffrage to all free white men above the age of 21 typically, although that varies by state in terms of the age requirements. But no state at this period yet allows women to vote. No state allows free blacks to vote. Native Americans can't vote. There is no religious requirement for voting in this country. That was forbidden by the First Amendment, and the Constitution itself, quite frankly. But there is expansion through the 1820s of the vote for all free white men. No longer do you have to prove that you own a certain amount of property to be able to vote. This is sometimes called the Jacksonian Revolution because the first guy who really benefits from this, ordinary man now can vote. So Andrew Jackson represents himself as sort of an ordinary guy, like a hero of the people, a populist. He's our very first populist president. And you can see he really wins these new states. These are all new states. These are all frontier states. These are all independent farmers for the most part, and poor farmers, people who prior to this did not have the vote. Whereas the states that John Quincy Adams wins in 1828 are in the old, foundational colonies of New England and New Jersey, and he wins part of New York. So it's sort of the old school is still going with the old school Federalists, John Quincy Adams, but Jackson sweeps all these new voters, and that's how he becomes president. You can see the popular vote was fairly close. The Electoral College vote was a landslide. This also, and you'll read about this election of 1828 followed a very controversial election in 1824, in which John Quincy Adams became president. And the 4 years between 1824 and 1828, Andrew Jackson would keep alive his. He accused John Quincy Adams of corruption and other malfeasance that also helped launch him into popularity and into the presidency in 1828. And it is very much the birth of modern politics. Because so many new people can vote, they're still all white males, yes, but there's so many new people that populism becomes a thing in American population. You now, to become president or to hold other office in America, you have to try to appeal to the ordinary man, and that was something brand new. So Andrew Jackson becomes president. One of the most notorious events of his presidency was Indian removal. We sometimes call this the Trail of Tears. Thousands upon thousands of natives were forced from their homes in their traditional lands to Oklahoma. What's now Oklahoma was being created a bunch of Indian reservations for them, and thousands died along the way. So your book will talk about this. Notable are the Cherokee, who essentially did everything the authorities asked of them. But then the Georgia militia wanted to run the Cherokee out of Georgia because gold had been found up in the Appalachians of northwest Georgia. And the Cherokee actually got essentially an injunction against the state of Georgia from the Supreme Court of the United States. But President Jackson essentially failed to enforce that decree by the Supreme Court, and the Cherokee were forced off their land. Okay, and then the final chapter is all about the Old South, antebellum South, meaning the pre-war South. It was all about cotton. It was about a plantation system. So chapter 13 really gets into the social structure of the Old South. Pay attention there, because what's happening there is there's a very stratified social system in the South, and it's very much connected to two things, cotton and slavery. So, and really without cotton and without slavery, there is no society in the Old South. So increasingly, as Southerners become more and more dependent on both cotton and slavery, they become more and more paranoid that their system of life, their way of life, is going to be under attack from the North. So tensions, I mean, we already have a huge divide between the North and the South in terms of societies and values, and the North is already more urban than not, where the South remains completely agricultural. In the North, education is basically available to everyone, including by the mid-century, even girls are starting to get education. Not to the same extent as young men, but it's starting to happen. In other words, education is a highly valued institution in the North, and in the South there's not a lot of schools. Illiteracy is rampant in the South. Literacy is the order of the day in the North. So all these differences, both socially and culturally, and chapter 13 really gets into what that was like in the South, the class structure. Notice how the majority of Southerners don't own slaves. The number of people who actually owned slaves was about 25%, and the number who owned a whole bunch of slaves was even much lower than that. So pay attention to that. Pay attention to the social structure in the South among whites, and then notice that among black slaves, there's also a complete social structure and a hierarchy there. So that is what we got on tap here for week 5.